Behind an old wardrobe on wheels in a respectable house in San Isidro, there was a door barely 70 centimeters high. On the other side, in a concrete basement with newspaper-covered walls, a man sat chained to a cot, waiting for his family to pay his ransom. And when the money came, it almost never mattered. Most of them were killed anyway. Upstairs in that same house, a family lived an ordinary life. They had dinner, they went to church. The eldest son, a rugby star, played for Los Pumas, Argentina's national team. The neighbors waved to them across the street, and for years no one imagined what was beneath the floor. The father had worked for the state's own intelligence service. The son shone on the field, and the real family business of the Puccios, hidden in the basement of their own home, was kidnapping for ransom. Between 1982 and 1985, they took 4 people and murdered 3. But the most disturbing part of this story isn't how they were caught. It's what happened afterward. Neither of the clan's 2 ringleaders died behind bars. How an entire family built a dungeon under their house, how it all came crashing down, and how they ended up free, that's what we're going to see. They were known by a single word: the clan. This is the story of the Puccio family. Fully, no filter. This is Uncut Cases. Real crimes, no filter. Let's get into it. To understand the Puccios, you have to start with the father. Arquímedes Puccio was a cultured, intelligent, deeply controlling man. He ran his family the way someone runs an operation. But the most important thing about him was outside the home. Arquímedes had been tied to Argentina's state intelligence services during the years of the military dictatorship, and, according to several sources, to the AAA, the far-right paramilitary group that spread terror in the 1970s. That detail is not decoration. It's the key to the whole case, because it gave him methods, contacts, and almost certainly the protection that kept the law away from his door for years. Arquímedes improvised nothing. He was a man of spreadsheets, schedules, and total control, who ran his family with the same discipline he would later run his crimes. In his house, the father's word was law, and the children grew up under an authority that allowed no questions and no disobedience. He carried that same methodical coldness into crime. He didn't grab just anyone in just any way. He studied his potential victims, learned their movements, knew which families had money and how much they could pay. He wasn't an impulsive criminal acting out of need or rage. He was, in the most chilling sense of the word, an administrator of kidnapping, someone who treated crime as a business with costs, revenue, and risks to manage. And his time in the intelligence services in the country's darkest years hadn't only given him techniques to watch, interrogate, and make people disappear. It had taught him something far more dangerous, that certain people with the right contacts and the right face can do terrible things to others and keep drinking their morning coffee as if nothing had happened. Arquímedes had watched the state do it. Then he did it himself in his own home. He and his wife Epifania Calvo had 5 children: Alejandro, Daniel, Guillermo, Silvia, and Adriana. They lived in a house in San Isidro on Martín y Omar Street, a leafy, affluent neighborhood, the kind where people assume crime happens somewhere else. On the surface, the Puccios were a model family. There was a shop out front. There was Sunday Mass. There was the comfortable rhythm of a respectable upper-middle-class life. And there, in plain sight, is the engine of this whole story. The Puccios didn't hide in the shadows. They hid behind their neighbor's good opinion. Their disguise was respectability itself: the business, the church, the family, the address. The most dangerous thing about them wasn't a weapon. It was how normal they looked. People who would have shut the door on an obvious criminal welcomed the Puccios, trusted them, envied them. Behind that facade, Arquímedes built something monstrous. An enterprise to kidnap wealthy people from his own social world, lock them in his house, extort their families for ransom, and then kill them. And he pulled his own children into the work. He wasn't an outsider preying on a community. He was a respected member of it, turning his neighbors into prey. And the brightest piece of his disguise, the part that made the whole illusion believable, was his eldest son. If Arquímedes was the brain of the clan, Alejandro was its mask. Alejandro Puccio was the eldest son, and by any measure he was a genuinely gifted athlete, a star of the Casi, the prestigious rugby club in San Isidro, and good enough to wear the jersey of Los Pumas, Argentina's national team. In Argentina, rugby is a sport of the educated, the respectable, the well-born. To be a Puma is to be admired, held up as an example. Alejandro was exactly that, clean-cut, talented, the kind of young man parents pointed to and said, "Be like him." To understand the weight of what Alejandro meant, you have to understand what rugby is in the Argentina of those years. It wasn't just any sport. It was the sport of private schools, of old family names, of upper-class respectability. A Casi player in the Los Pumas jersey was, almost by definition, someone above all suspicion, someone society looks at with admiration and never with distrust. When Alejandro walked onto the field, the stands saw an idol. No one could even imagine where he came from or what house he went back to after the match. His talent wasn't only a source of family pride, it was the best alibi money couldn't buy. His fame shielded him and shielded all the Puccios along with him. While the whole country watched the flawless athlete, no one had any reason to look at the basement. In a sense, Alejandro was the most effective piece of the entire operation. Whether he knew what he was carrying or not, he was the public smile that made the monster invisible. And there's the horror hiding in plain sight. While Alejandro trained, competed, and won, while the stands chanted his name and the papers printed his results, his family was kidnapping human beings and holding them captive in the house where he lived. He played for the national team during the same years the clan was taking victims. He was the public face of a respectable family, and the respectable family was the front for an enterprise of kidnapping and murder. This is the question the case forces on you, and that was never fully answered. How much did the Golden Son really know? Was Alejandro a willing, active member of the clan, an athlete by day and a kidnapper by night, fully aware of the man chained beneath the floor of his house? Or was he, as he would insist until his dying breath, an innocent caught in his father's web, a son so dominated by an iron patriarch that he somehow lived alongside captivity and death without fully grasping what it was? The courts would reach a clear verdict, but the image of the rugby hero celebrated on the field while a victim was held in the basement of his own home is the picture that burned this case into Argentine memory and made it impossible to forget. A monster you see coming is frightening. A monster with the face of the nation's pride is something else entirely. But Alejandro's fame was only half the trick. The other half was hidden beneath the floor of the house. The heart of the Puccio's horror was not in plain view. It was beneath the house. In a room on the ground floor stood an old wardrobe on wheels. Slide it aside and a tiny door appeared, barely 70 centimeters high. And behind that little door was a cell of reinforced concrete, built so no one would find it and no one would escape it. The walls were papered with sheets of newspaper. The floor was bare dirt. The whole place was designed with cold, calculated cruelty. They wanted the captive, blindfolded and disoriented, to believe he was being held in some run-down dwelling, or a country house in the middle of nowhere and not in a comfortable home in San Isidro, steps from a busy street. The most disturbing detail is one that seems pulled from a nightmare. In the basement, they had installed a fan blowing over bales of wet hay to artificially generate a country smell. It was engineering of deception. Every element, the dirt, the newspapers, the smell, was meant to confuse the victim about where they were, to strip away any reference point, any hope of locating themselves and calling for help. The same methodical mind that had learned the state's methods now applied them, brick by brick, in the basement of his own house. And not all of the horror was beneath the house. Inside the same home, there was also a bathtub used to hold victims captive, another corner of a family home turned into a cell. The logistics of all this were as cold as the rest. You had to take a person off the street without anyone noticing, get them into a car, drive them to San Isidro, bring them down a narrow staircase, and lock them behind a piece of furniture. All in a neighborhood where neighbors greeted each other across the street and the houses knew one another. Every step required cold blood, coordination, and an ability to lie in broad daylight that's hard to imagine. But for the Puccios, lying wasn't the exception. It was the family's natural state. They could serve a customer in the shop out front, wave to a neighbor, take a son to a match, and at the same time keep a human being chained a few meters away, waiting for them to decide whether he lived or died. That coexistence of the ordinary and the monstrous is what makes this case so hard to digest. The clan's method was cold and built to repeat. They didn't grab strangers at random. They chose young people and wealthy businessmen from their own social world, people connected to families with money, whom Archimedes could research, approach, and isolate. They kidnapped them, brought them down to that basement or held them in the house, and then opened a negotiation with the terrified family for a ransom. And here's the detail that defines the clan and sets it apart from ordinary kidnappers. Paying the ransom didn't buy freedom. It only added profit to a murder that was already decided. The respectable house above and the cell below weren't two separate worlds. They were the same business. Upstairs they had dinner, downstairs someone waited to die. And those weren't empty threats. Behind that basement there were at least 3 people with names, surnames, and a family waiting for them. The clan's first known victim was Ricardo Manukian. He was 23, the son of a well-off family, and he disappeared on July 22, 1982. The Puccios took him, hid him, and demanded money. His family did everything a desperate family is supposed to do. They paid an enormous sum, hundreds of thousands of dollars, handed over to get a son back. It made no difference at all. Ricardo Manukian was killed anyway, with a single shot. The ransom was simply money on top of a death that was always coming. That was the pattern from the very first crime, and it's what makes the Puccio case so uniquely cruel. The kidnapping was never truly a negotiation. There was no real deal on the table, no genuine chance to save the captive. It was a death sentence with an invoice attached. Collect the money, then kill the witness. In May 1983, they kidnapped an engineer named Eduardo Aulet. Again, the family negotiated. Again, they paid the ransom. And again, it bought nothing. Aulet was killed too. The pattern was now unmistakable to anyone close enough to see it. The Puccios took, the Puccios extorted, and the Puccios killed, whether or not the family paid. The ransom was never the deal. It was simply the harvest. In 1984, they went after a man named Emilio Nam. But Nam did something the others hadn't been able to do. He fought back during the abduction, and the clan's response stripped away any illusion that this was only about money. They shot him on the spot and left his body in the street. There was no captivity, no ransom call, no negotiation. He resisted, and they killed him in the open and moved on. And behind each of those names is a family that was never the same again. Parents who sold what they had to scrape together a ransom. Siblings who waited by the phone for days on end. Mothers who handed over fortunes in the hope of getting a child back and who received instead a body or a silence that would last forever. The pain of those families was often buried under the fascination with the killers, but it is the true wound of this case. The Puccios didn't only destroy the people they killed, they destroyed everyone who loved them too, and left them trapped in a question that would never have a peaceful answer. Was it worth anything to have paid? That added cruelty, charging for a life they had already decided to take, is perhaps the coldest thing in the whole story. They didn't kill out of need or fury. They killed as part of a calculation, and they charged in advance. 3 dead, 3 families destroyed. And there's a detail that is still a mystery today. Much of the ransom money never appeared. The families paid fortunes, and those fortunes to a large extent vanished. Meanwhile, everything was run out of the house in San Isidro, where a human being could be chained in the basement while, a few meters above, the family lived the life the whole neighborhood envied. Think about what that means day after day, a captive listening through the floor to the sounds of an ordinary family. The dishes, the conversation, the television, the footsteps while he waited for them to decide his fate. A nice house, a respected family, a Los Pumas star at the table. And Below, someone chained in the dark. That darkness had its days numbered. But it took a fourth victim, and one who this time survived, for the truth to finally come to light. What finally broke the Puccios was their last victim and the fact that, this time, the world had changed around them. In 1985, they kidnapped Nelida Bolini de Prado, a 58-year-old businesswoman, and locked her in the basement. For more than a month, they kept her down there, chained to a cot between newspaper walls while the family went about its normal life over her head. But the clan's old protection was running out. Argentina had emerged from the military dictatorship and was returning to democracy and the rule of law. The connections that had once made Arquímedes untouchable, the ties to the intelligence world, no longer carried the same power. For the first time, investigators were able to close in. The net didn't close overnight. For years, the kidnappings in the northern suburbs of Buenos Aires had left a trail of shattered families and frustrated investigators who suspected that behind so much precision was someone with information and with protection above the ordinary. While the dictatorship cast its shadow, those threads cut themselves off. There were doors that couldn't be touched, but with democracy, that impunity began to crack. Investigators could follow leads that used to disappear, get close to names that used to be untouchable. The surveillance finally reached the house on Martini Omar Street, and when they confirmed that there was a living person inside, held captive, there was no longer any room to wait for the perfect moment. They had to go in before that victim met the same fate as the others. On the night of August 23, 1985, police raided the house in San Isidro. They moved the wardrobe, opened the little door, and went down. What they found there ended the illusion forever. Nelida Bolini de Prado was still alive, tied to the floor of the basement, the only one of the 4 victims to survive, rescued from the very hideout of the respectable family that had kidnapped her. The operation took out no one alive but her. The Puccios were arrested. Alejandro, the rugby star, was found at the house. The shop, the trophies, the church, the address. All of it collapsed in a single night into what it had always really been. The front for a kidnapping and murder ring. And for Argentina, the timing made it land even harder. The country was just beginning to face the horrors of the dictatorship. The disappeared, the secret detention centers, the state violence hidden behind official respectability. And suddenly it had in front of it a private version of the same nightmare. People kidnapped and held captive from a basement by a man formed in the machinery of the state, protected for years by the very structures that should have stopped him. The Puccio case was not just a shocking crime story. It was a mirror held up to a wounded nation, and the reflection was unbearable. And then the question stopped being what the Puccios had done. It became another one: what justice was going to do with them. The court sentenced Arquímedes Puccio and his son Alejandro each to life in prison for the kidnappings and murders. Daniel, another son who took part, was given a lesser sentence and got out earlier. Guillermo, the youngest son, had broken away from the family long before the fall and avoided justice by leaving the country. The mother, Epifania, and the 2 daughters, Silvia and Adriana, were never convicted. The clan as an operation was finished. But Alejandro's story took, almost immediately, the darkest turn of all. On November 8, 1985, a few months after the fall, Alejandro threw himself from the 5th floor of the court's building in an apparent attempt to take his own life. He survived the fall, but his body was left devastated. And it wouldn't be his only time. Over his years in prison, he attempted suicide several times, and as a result of one of those attempts, he began to suffer episodes of convulsions that would send him to the hospital again and again. Inside prison, Alejandro tried to rebuild something. He studied psychology. In 1993, already a prisoner, he married a woman named Nancy Arat, and the whole time he held, without budging an inch, the same version: that he was innocent, that he had only been a rugby player caught in his father's world, that he had never known what happened in his own house. Whether you believe that, an athlete on the national team who somehow noticed nothing while people were held and killed in the basement beneath his room, is one of the questions this case leaves open. But the verdicts were clear and the bodies were real. Alejandro's years in prison were a long downward spiral. The leap from the 5th floor of the courts was only the first of several attempts to end his life, and each one left him more broken than the last. From one of those attempts, he carried the convulsions that would follow him the rest of his life. Between hospital stays, his studies, his marriage, and his stubborn refusal to accept his guilt, Alejandro became an almost ghostly figure, the former Puma who insisted, against all the evidence and against the verdict of the courts, that they had gotten it wrong about him. Argentina watched him with a mix of fascination and revulsion, never quite deciding whether it was looking at a cold killer or a son destroyed by his father. And perhaps, and that is precisely the discomfort of this case, he was both at the same time a victim of Arquímedes Puccio and at once a piece of his machinery. And yet, and this is what almost no one remembers, neither Alejandro nor his father would end their days behind bars. And here is the part the case often leaves out, but which matters. Neither of the two main Puccios died behind bars. Alejandro was released. In November 2007, after more than 2 decades in prison, he got out on parole, under the control of the probation service, with a social worker visiting him every month to verify where and with whom he lived. But his freedom was short. Barely 8 months later, on June 27, 2008, Alejandro Puccio died at the age of 49 after an infection contracted in a hospital where he had been admitted for the convulsions he'd carried since his suicide attempts. He died free, yes, but broken and swearing to the end that he was innocent. His father followed the same road. In 2008, Arquímedes Puccio was granted parole, benefiting among other things from the old 2x1 law, and chose to go live in General Pico, in the province of La Pampa. There, the man who had run a basement of terror rebuilt his life in plain sight. He opened his own law office and practiced as an attorney until shortly before his death. At the time he died, in his 80s, he had separated a few months earlier from a much younger woman and was living with a pastor from an evangelical church who cared for him. On May 4, 2013, Arquímedes Puccio died in his bed, in his sleep, of complications from a stroke. The pastor found him. He ended up buried in a common grave, and like his son, he went to his grave proclaiming his innocence. A man who seemed to believe his own version long after a court and an entire country had rejected it. There's something deeply disturbing in that image. The two men who had turned their home into a kidnapping den ended their days in freedom, walking down the street, serving a customer, sleeping in their own beds. For many of the victims' families, seeing the patriarch of the clan practicing law in a town in the interior, or the rugby son dying free while swearing his innocence, was a second wound. Justice had done its part: trial, conviction, years in prison, and still the ending looked nothing like a final punishment. That gap between what we feel a crime deserves and what the law ultimately delivers is one of the things this case leaves hanging, unresolved, long after the lights go out. The rest of the family followed its own fate. Sylvia, one of the daughters who taught art, died of cancer in 2011. Guillermo, the one who had fled the country, never faced Argentine justice. Epifania, the mother, and Adriana, the youngest daughter, were never convicted and for years remained tied to the house in San Isidro, the ghost house, an ordinary address on an ordinary street that had become one of the most infamous in Argentina. And above all, an unsolved enigma remained. Much of the ransom money, fortunes that desperate families paid to get their loved ones back, never appeared. Here is what I want to say directly. The Puccio case became a film, a series, and a permanent part of Argentine memory. And it's easy to see why. It has everything a story needs to grip a country: a perfect family, a rugby hero, a controlling father with a secret past, a beautiful house with a basement of terror underneath. The fascination is real, and so is the temptation to turn the Puccios into characters in a thriller. But the heart of this case isn't the clan's strangeness, it's the people they killed. Ricardo Manukian, 23, whose family paid every dollar they were asked and got back his body. Eduardo Aulé, an engineer killed after handing over his ransom in good faith. Emilio Naum, shot dead in the street for the crime of resisting, and Nelidio Bolini de Prado, who spent more than a month chained in a concrete basement and walked out alive, the only survivor of 4, the one who lived to remind us that these were real people, not plot points. And it's worth saying one more thing, because it's easy to lose it amid all the morbid fascination. This was not the crime of a lone madman or a desperate outcast. It was the crime of an entire family educated with money, with a name and a place in society. That is what's hardest to accept and what should make us think the most. Evil in the Puccio case didn't come from the margins or from poverty or from what people fear when they lock the door at night. It came from inside the respectable neighborhood, from a house with a garden, from a family dinner table. We like to believe horror has a recognizable face, that it comes from outside and can be seen coming. The Puccios remind us in the worst way that sometimes it has the calmest face in the neighborhood. And beneath the family drama is the harder layer, the one that makes this case so specifically Argentine. Arquímedes Puccio was not just a criminal father. He was a man formed by the state's own machinery of intelligence and violence, who carried those skills home and turned them on his neighbors, and who was shielded from justice for years by the very people he had worked for. The clan was monstrous on its own, but it grew in the gap between a dictatorship ending and the rule of law returning. And there's something else that's unsettling to this day. Neither of the 2 ringleaders died in prison. Both walked free, both rebuilt a life on the outside, and both went to their graves swearing they were innocent. One with his own law office in La Pampa, the other in a hospital bed, while 3 families kept counting their dead. So what do you think? Was Alejandro Puccio, the Los Pumas star, truly an innocent caught in his father's web, or a knowing member of the clan who hid behind his own fame? And how does a family live an ordinary life, Sunday mass, Saturday matches, with a human being chained in the basement of their own house? Drop your take in the comments. I read every one.